A singer in ancient Greece carried a melody that changed every time he opened his mouth. Writing earlier this month for The Honest Broker, Ted Gioia says the Odyssey is a jazz session, something meant to be heard. A similar effort shows up in a piece published just today by Furaha Ruguru for Africa is a Country. While Gioia looks to revive the spirit of Greek epics, Ruguru follows African musicians using digital tools to pull their own ancestral songs out of cold storage in Europe. Something interesting emerges here. A culture's memory might live in the return of the living voice, rather than in a silent archive. In an essay from last week, Ted Gioia looks past the leather-bound prestige of the Odyssey to find the pulse of a mass-market pulp story. Writing as a new film version hits theaters, he suggests that Homer functioned less like a stiff poet and more like the Stan Lee of antiquity. Notice how he treats the epic as a live performance, more like a jazz set than a silent book, that belongs to the crowd, not the classroom.
What you won't learn about the Odyssey from a movie. Christopher Nolan's film version makes its debut in London today. The first work of classical literature that thrilled me to the depths of my soul was the Odyssey. It made such a big impact that decades later, I insisted on reading it aloud to my own children, hoping they would feel that same magic. I was little more than a child back when I discovered Homer, 12 or 13 years old, I'd guess. Back then, I knew more about comic books than serious literature, but I was outgrowing Spider-Man and Superman and decided to take a chance on Odysseus. I approached this book with fear and trembling, worried it might be too difficult. But I soon discovered that Homer was the Stan Lee of antiquity. He told adventure stories not much different from the ones peddled by Marvel or DC. Please support The Honest Broker by taking out a premium subscription, just $6 per month. I'd somehow gotten my hands on a tattered used paperback copy of the Odyssey in a 1937 prose translation by W.H.D. Rouse, published by Mentor Classics. Cover price when new, 60 cents. This is not a respected translation. They will never assign Rouse's run of Homer at any Ivy League college. That's because the legit translators try to convey this epic as poetry. Rouse made no attempt at that. He just turned Homer into everyday language, just like it was a pulp fiction story for the mass market. That was the right choice, he believed, because, as he wrote in his introduction, the Odyssey is the best story ever written. It has been a favorite for 3,000 years. Other translations of this book are, he claimed, filled with affectations and attempts at a poetic language Homer himself is free from.
Homer speaks naturally, and we must do the same. You can see the difference by comparing Rouse's rendering of the opening lines with the esteemed Chapman translation from Shakespeare's era. Is this the best version of Homer? I won't go that far. Years later, I became very fond of Robert Fitzgerald's translation. But I will insist that Rouse is the superior version for a youngster. And in many ways, youngsters were Homer's target audience. You can feel that at every turn in his story. So this is the first thing about the Odyssey you won't learn at Harvard. Namely, that this tale was not intended for Harvard elites. It's a story for everybody. So it's an obvious choice for a big-budget Hollywood movie. There was no pretension or elitism in Homer's approach. In today's parlance, you would say that he was appealing to a mass audience. Director Christopher Nolan, whose screen version of the Odyssey makes its debut in London today, relied on the more recent Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey into iambic pentameter. In her version, our hero is described, like Shaft, as a complicated man who won't cop out when there's danger all about. Okay, she doesn't use those exact words, but comes close. I like this rendering, and can almost hear that Isaac Hayes synth vamp in the background. Wilson is just as straightforward as Rouse, living up to her aspiration to tell the old story for modern times. Yes, I'd love to hear Homer delivered with this music in the background. And that brings me to my most important point. If Nolan really wanted to be bold, he would take a far more radical step and reclaim the Odyssey's original status as a song. In ancient Greece, this work was not a text, for the simple reason that few members of its audience could read. It was performed. That's a truth rarely mentioned, and the single most important fact about Homer that is hidden from view nowadays. His work ought to be taught in the department of music, But even music scholars have bought into the big lie that Homer is literature, not song. So if you track down the most influential books on Homer, you will find that they are all written by classicists or humanists, not experts on music. Even an astute scholar like Walter Ong, who focuses on the oral tradition in his influential book Orality and Literacy, scrupulously avoids discussing music, even though song is the origin of the entire oral tradition he celebrates. I tried to rectify this in my books Music, A Subversive History, and Music to Raise the Dead, where I reclaim Homer as part of our musical heritage. And it's not just Homer's epics that originated as music. The same is true of lyric poetry, philosophy, even the legal code. They were all originally sung. And here's where I finally give some credit to Harvard. We have a good idea of how these epics were sung because almost 100 years ago, 2 Harvard scholars tried to track down the last living epic bards. These scholars were Milman Parry and Albert Lord. Parry did most of the initial work, but because he died young, much of the credit went to Lord, whose book The Singer of Tales is still the best starting point for learning about the real Homeric tradition. Those 2 academics deserve the same esteem accorded to Ong, McLuhan, Fry, Derrida, Searle, and other celebrated theorists of narrative and communication. I first encountered The Singer of Tales as a college student and was shocked to learn from Lord how much these epic singers resembled jazz musicians. That's the third important fact about the Odyssey you won't learn from Hollywood or your college Intro to Humanities course. In both instances, the epic poet and jazz musician, the performer learns numerous stock phrases of specific metrical length and often uses these repeatedly in live renditions. For Homer, these are the descriptors that recur in the Odyssey, such as rosy-fingered dawn or swift-footed Achilles. Jazz musicians do the same thing, but their building blocks are known as licks. This video, well known in jazz circles, provides fascinating examples of one such lick. In 1935, Milman and Parry discovered a remarkable singer named Avdo Medjedovic, who was born in the Ottoman Empire circa 1875, before the days of commercial recordings. He was a true singer of tales and accompanied himself on a one-string instrument called the gusla. They captured performances by this amazing individual on film and in recordings, and these provide a glimpse of what the Odyssey might have sounded like to its first listeners. I'd ask anyone who wants to grasp the reality of Homer to watch this short video. This is the actual origin of the epic tradition, not those fancy books on the library shelves. I wrote about this bard in my online book, Music to Raise the Dead. The gusla is played not for melodic embellishment or even what nowadays we call a bass line, but generates a pulsating rhythmic drone. Medjedovic's singing for its part sounds like an incantation, and he appears to have fallen into a kind of trance. You can easily imagine listeners falling into a similar trance given the hypnotic and ritualistic nature of the proceedings. The gusla also served another role for these singers, namely as a mnemonic support.
Medjedovic displayed extraordinary memory skills, far beyond what the Harvard researchers believed was possible. At one point, he performed a song for his visitors that went on for 7 days. When it was later transcribed, this one song filled up more than 12,000 lines, by coincidence, the same length of Homer's Odyssey. A song that lasts for 7 days? If that happened now, it would be some kind of stunt or avant-garde demonstration. Yet even in that context, you couldn't imagine a singer performing 12,000 lines of lyrics from memory. But precisely this happened in ancient Greece at the dawn of Western culture. No Hollywood movie can adequately convey this kind of tradition, no matter how many superstars are in the cast or how much money is spent on special effects. What we learn from Avdo Medjedovic is that works like the Odyssey are ritualistic and trance-inducing. They are propelled by music and driven by rhythm. They cross a border beyond literature and enter something more transcendent and metaphysical. You won't find any of that in a book because it can't fit inside a book. It's too large for books. And if Hollywood could ever figure out how to transfer this type of creative ritual onto a screen, they would change the entire course of cinema. But is there a single director today capable of that degree of boldness? This birth of literature out of a magical mystery song is our inheritance from the past, and one of incalculable value. We do ourselves a disservice if we don't find ways of tapping into its primordial energy in the current day. Where does that happen? That's a subject for a different day and a different article.
but I'll say for a start that you won't find it in a library or classroom.
It's most likely to occur at live music events, especially those that possess ritualistic intensity. Let's both go on a quest to discover it and keep each other posted.
Ted Gioia leaves the listener with the image of a performer sweating under the lights, improvising like a jazz musician to keep a crowd hooked. The point is that the Odyssey only breathes when it's spoken aloud. A story trapped on a silent page is a story that has lost its pulse. This makes Furaha Ruguru's report from Nairobi feel even more urgent. While Gioia wants to rescue an ancient Greek singer from the quiet of a library, Ruguru is looking at thousands of African musicians whose voices are literally locked in boxes in Germany and Belgium. Notice how both writers treat sound as something that can be stolen or lost when it's turned into an object for experts to study. Gioia argues that elite translators kill the spirit of a story by making it too polite. Ruguru shows how colonial researchers took the physical recordings themselves, turning living culture into a catalog that the original communities can't even hear. The interesting thing is that digital tools, which often get blamed for killing old traditions, are the very things Ruguru's subjects use to pick the locks of those European museums. In Nairobi, a laptop isn't just a gadget, it's a way to turn a stored artifact back into a live song.
From colonial storage to open access. For a century, African musical heritage was recorded, boxed, and shipped to museums abroad. In Nairobi, a new generation of archives is bringing cultural memory home and putting it online. It's a cozy Thursday evening in Nairobi, and important conversations are about to begin. I ask my sound engineer, "Are you ready to record?" She signals yes. Deep breath in. Hold the mic close. Welcome to Hadithi Hangout Chapter. This is just one of the many conversations recorded and archived across Africa every single week. But why do we do it? Every single day, African creatives produce live performances, radio shows, DJ mixes, panel discussions, and cultural conversations. But where do these moments go after all is said and done? Our continent has a long tradition of preserving and sharing knowledge through oral literature, songs, proverbs, and legends. During the colonial era, foreign researchers, institutions, and labels recorded African musical heritage and took them away. Today, many of these sound recordings remain caged in museums abroad or locked behind academic paywalls, accessible only to researchers and those who can afford them. To access the 14,000 recordings held by the African Music Archive, for example, you still need to travel to Mainz, Germany. Meanwhile, the International Library of African Music, ILAM, founded in South Africa in 1954 by ethnomusicologist Hugh Tracy, has only recently begun digitizing parts of its vast collection and making them available online. The question remains, who gets to access African cultural memory? Kenyan sound artist KMRU explored this question in his 2023 album, Temporary Stored. Blending sound synthesizers, field recordings, and archival recordings from the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Belgium, the project liberates these stolen sounds from the colonial archive. Today, African creatives and organizations are increasingly taking music preservation into their own hands. Empowered with digital technology, recording equipment, and online platforms, they are documenting traditional music, digitizing historical recordings, and creating new archives that are finally accessible to African audiences. Why does accessibility matter? Because preservation without access is still exclusion. Accessible archives help us reclaim culture, challenge colonial interpretations, and ensure African artists are the ones telling their own stories. Here are 4 music archives in Kenya doing exactly that. Based at the Mall in Westlands, Nairobi, Tamasha Records is one of East Africa's most important custodians of recorded African music history. The company was established in the early 1990s after Polygram East Africa exited the region, leaving behind one of the largest recorded music catalogs in East Africa. The collection contains more than 10,000 recordings from artists active between the 1950s and 1980s. Tamasha has spent decades digitizing vinyl and CD recordings by legendary artists such as Franco Luambo, Tabule Rasharo, and Daudi Kabaka. These recordings are now available through streaming and download platforms. For many music listeners, Tamasha's YouTube channel has become a nostalgic bridge into the world of classic East African music, also known as Zili Sopendwa. This is music which might have otherwise disappeared into storage rooms and deteriorating master tapes. A similar urgency, if a different approach, shapes Singing Wells.
In 2011, cultural practitioners Tabu Osusa of Ketable Music and Jimmy Allen of the UK's Abubilla Music bonded over one common concern. Traditional East African music was disappearing as older musicians passed away and younger generations gravitated toward global popular culture. So what did they do? They founded the Singing Wells Project, got their teams in a van, and traveled across East Africa recording musicians in their own communities rather than bringing them into urban studios. 15 years later, Singing Wells has become the world's largest open archive of traditional East African music. Its online collection contains hundreds of recordings documenting music and dance traditions from Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda. Beyond music, Singing Wells also publishes musician biographies, field reports, and instrument documentation on their website, making it an invaluable resource for researchers, educators, and artists alike who are seeking to reconnect and gain inspiration from their cultural roots. Founded in 2013 by David Tinning and Greg Tendwa, Santori East Africa has become a leader in music education, artist development, and cultural innovation. While Tamasha preserves historical recordings and Singing Wells documents traditional music, Santori archives the present. Through Santori Salon at the mall, the community space hosts panel discussions, listening sessions, and artist talks focused on music, culture, and technology. Many of these conversations are recorded and uploaded online, creating a living archive of contemporary East African culture. One such archive is Hadithi Hangout, a monthly reading group exploring Kenya's political and musical histories. Listeners can revisit conscious conversations on everything from the impact of colonialism on contemporary music to the evolution of Kenyan music across the generations. For future researchers looking to understand East Africa's creative landscape in the 2020s, these recordings may be just as valuable as historical music collections. The fourth is Calotropis Radio, which flips the model. If traditional archives collect history after it happens, this community radio station records it as it unfolds. Founded in Nairobi and also based at the mall, Calotropis describes itself as a dealer in sound, music, and poetry. When they are not playing eclectic music selections on their website, they live stream and archive DJ sets, community conversations, and cultural events. Since 2025, they have partnered with Kilele Summit, Santori's annual festival for adventurous music and technology, streaming panel discussions and artist workshops to audiences far beyond Nairobi. Calotropis demonstrates that sometimes archives are built live, one broadcast at a time. These African archives remind us that the power to tell and preserve our own stories is now in our hands. Preserving African culture does not look one way. It can mean digitizing old records, documenting traditional musicians in remote villages, recording community discussions, or live streaming experimental performances to audiences around the world. What matters is that these stories remain available. Accessible archives allow culture to be studied, remembered, and reimagined. And they help future generations understand who we were, what we created, and what we valued. Ultimately, sometimes preserving culture begins with something as simple as holding a microphone close and pressing record.
A stack of paper or a hard drive in a vault stays silent until someone sings the notes. An ancient Greek melody and a beat pulled from a museum basement only matter when they're heard. There's a friction in trying to hold on to the past. Sometimes the act of locking a song away actually kills it. Keeping a story alive seems to require a bit of noise and a little mess. When a culture finally gets its voice back, how much of the original song should stay the same, and how much must change to survive?